Hamatakiapi, Chantewa Este Nape Chuzapedo, Tachakpito Kahea Inkpamani Emakiapi, Sisitua Makocha Edwati, Skiskitua Otrue Edwati, na Chihuahua, Mexico, na Wakpa Mastinchina Edwati in Hemataha. Hello everybody, my name is Inkpa Mani. I'm 25 years old and I live in Browns Valley, Minnesota. And I'm an artist and an educator at Tioshpezina Tribal School and Sisseton Wahpeton College. And I work primarily in stone sculptures and public art monuments. And I'm also a painter. I've worked on a couple different projects within this region, and most notably painted an 8-foot-tall painted buffalo hide at the National Eagle Center. And I'm here to kind of provide a little bit of a context and an understanding of some of the elements within this mural and why it's so important to have, depictions of Indigenous people, Dakota people, into our public spaces. Dakota people have been part of this land for over 20,000 years. And within those 20,000 years, there is language, culture, families, and just an understanding of the landscape that has continued to survive. Even though Dakota people were exiled and pushed away, there continued to be Dakota communities who came back into this landscape and resisted and believed that this land was so important that they would risk death, that they would risk discrimination, they would risk it all just to be where their ancestors were buried, where their ancestors had their camps, along the cottonwood trees, and they would continue to do things that became a statement of who they are, such as the Dakota floral designs. All of these elements, should come back and should be part of our public spaces because they had been so for the last 20,000 years. This town is named after a lineage of chiefs, Chief Wabasha, and his family. They come from a lineage that raised young men, young boys, from an early age. With some of these families, there's different roles, and one of the roles that's involved with that is raising your children to pass down knowledge. One of the things that would have happened, when he was a little boy or even when he was born, his grandmothers, his aunts, his uncles, his mom would all do these little different things, to raise him up to be the best leader that he could be. And the elders of the camp, would watch and kind of look at different traits and different characteristics that they could encourage to make them, the best that they could do. And one of the stories from this region of Minnesota, they talk about that in winter, they would take their babies and they would dip them into water, in cold water. And the idea was that it would strengthen their immune system, it would strengthen their nervous system. And there was some symbolism behind it that you'd hope and encourage that that child to be very sensitive to the world around him. And in this early 18 and mid 1800s era, to be sensitive around the world around you, and especially as a chief who has a whole community who is depending on you, these are traits that were pivotal for the survival of Dakota people. By the 1830s, 1840s, there's already accounts of Dakota people starving in Minnesota, and a lot of those young, children that were born in the 1830s, 1840s, they had to wait another 20 years before, they got their time to say, enough of this. Because one of the thoughts that I think about is, in the 1840s, a child might be born, and by the 1860s, they've heard their entire lives of this great Minnesota or Minnesota Makoche, of the plentiful of the land, the buffalo, the different animals that were just all around. And a lot of these young men at that time kind of had that frustration of being told all of the greatness, but also experiencing what life was at that time. That there wasn't enough to eat, constantly being pushed and shoved and made to be into smaller and smaller territories and eventually into a reservation. And these were some of the hardships, that Chief Wabasha had to face, in his lifetime, and watching, as different community members died of smallpox, either they were, died of disease or were killed, by settlers of this land who were coming into Minnesota. And so leadership in Dakota tradition, it's viewed kind of differently than it would be in American society or Western society, where in American or European society, you think of the person who is a leader sits at the top of a pyramid. But in Dakota beliefs, that pyramid is kind of inverted, where all of that pressure, all of the weight of your community is put on that leader. And it's oftentimes that leader is more of a spokesperson for the whole community. And there's, a whole group of women, a whole group of elders who stand directly behind that leader and kind of gives guidance and, says a thing or two. And then that chief has to convey that message in a very eloquent way. And a lot of these chiefs, like Chief Wabasha, they were noted as, exceptional orators, people who could speak publicly and deliver a message very clearly. And these are some of the things, that Wabasha was known for, and his family line especially was known for, being not only great men, but great fathers, great community leaders, and just good overall human beings of this territory. And this landscape, it's known as different names, but specifically this region right here was especially well known for quill work designs, because there was a bountiful amount of porcupines at one point in this area, and different times of the year, like Wabasha's band would come back, or Red Wing's band, or different chiefs would come back to this area and hunt the porcupine, and the women of that community would come back and they would use those quills from the porcupine and they would mix it with different vegetable plants, like bloodroot, which is depicted on the beadwork panel, and they would use those plants to decorate themselves, to adorn everything around them. And when we think about public art, land art, this is something that has existed here in Wabasha for thousands of years. It's not a modern concept, but it's a time-tested and ancient practice of it, thinking about space. So even the title with this, public spaces are sacred spaces. Every natural and sacred space in the indigenous worldview or the Dakota worldview was a sacred space. It was a space that you beautified, you made inviting, and they were all accessible. Anybody could come into that space as long as they had a good mind, a positive attitude. They could interact with that place. And public art pre-contact looked not just like petroglyphs, but they're also painted stones. So throughout this landscape, there's early accounts in the 18 and 1700s that travelers would come in along this river, and on the sides of the banks they would see these painted red stones or different stones that were painted almost like monuments. So thinking about this landscape, those are all parts of what exists. And having public art is really important because it gives insight of what a community values. It shows that a community is being taken care of. It's giving back in some sort of way and sharing different messages. And within this mural, we have a couple different elements and symbols that indigenous people of this land really value. So whether it's the cottonwood tree, with the cottonwood tree, some of the importances with it is connected to the Wiwangwachi, or the Sundance ceremony. And one of the stories that I always think about when I look at cottonwood trees is that they said, Hekta ehana wanietu ota. Long time ago, there was a star that came from the Milky Way, and it loved the Dakota people so much and always wanted to be around their camps. Maybe it was a camp right around here in Wabasha, and it wanted to be with the people, so it asked some of the older stars if it could come and visit the people. And those older stars, they said, no, I'm not sure that's a good idea, but that younger star, that Wichachpi, thought, I want to do this. So he came down, that star came down, and this is the oral stories of, of the cottonwood tree, that star came down to the people and just hovered above a camp. And that camp was in an area next to these cottonwood trees. And so it watched the people constantly, and eventually the people kind of stopped doing their daily tasks because, if you were to see a star just floating above you, we would probably all stop and stare and kind of wonder what's going on. So this star stuck around, and the other stars they were watching, was happening down here, and they asked that star to come back because the people stopped tanning hides, they stopped gathering berries, they stopped, gathering and taking care of themselves because this star, pretty young little star was so pretty, and just they were in amazement. And so that star went back up, and when it went back up into the Milky Way, it kind of became sad and lonesome for the Dakota people. And that star kind of explained that, it loved the Dakota people because they sang a beautiful song. And that beautiful song was, the daily life, children playing along the river, women working on buffalo hides or, preparing foods, and men gathering and singing, telling their stories, going off hunting. Just the sound of a community was so beautiful to it. So that star made a deal with some of the other stars, and it asked if I could find a way to live amongst the Dakota people, but not distract them. Could I live with them and stay with them forever? And that the other stars in the Milky Way said, yeah, if that you could find a way to do that, you could stay with them. So they say that star, that was up in the Milky Way came down and shot itself in the center of this cottonwood tree. And that's still remembered today as, we go out and into nature. We'll often, go into any area, we do this with our students at the school that I teach at. We'll grab a cottonwood leaf and we'll break it in, or not a leaf, but a little branch, and we'll break that center of that branch, and there's a 5-pointed star at the center of that branch of the cottonwood leaf, and it's a reminder that this tree is a spiritual tree. They say that when its leaves rattle, it's making a prayer to the Creator, and because of that, they say that the cottonwood tree is the most prayerful of all of the trees, because as it shakes its leaves, and it's making that motion, it's sending those prayers up. So because of that, Dakota people often place their camps along cottonwood leaves. And in Dakota worldview and indigenous worldview, you can often think about, this specific worldview that developed in North America or in Minnesota, broken down into 3 main groupings. It was very practical. It was spiritual, and it was often in connection with kinship. So if you're thinking about, Dakota worldview, it's connected to kinship, practicality, and spiritual law. And so the spiritual part of it is that this tree is constantly praying. It has a spirit connected to it. The practical side of it is that, if you're camped next to a cottonwood tree, cottonwoods are always breaking down. They grow fast. You have good shade. But these leaves and branches will fall down, and that's easy wood to gather and to use right away. So that's kind of one story connected to the cottonwood tree. They also say that one of the first teepee that was created was little children playing with the large leaves of a female cottonwood tree, and they were rolling them into that teepee shape. And they say that up above with the Wakantaka key, the spirits who are above, they had already developed that teepee, but it was the children that brought the teepee down here, and kind of connected the as above, so below to this landscape.
Matakiapi, Ambetikile, Shante Washte, Napi, Nape. Chiujapi, my name is Jalea Whitecloud. I am 21 years old. I live in Browns Valley, Minnesota. My mom is Janelle Harryshirt. My dad is Wamni Amini Whitecloud. My grandma is Winona Tukro Hexum, and my grandpa is William Harryshirt. I am from the Sanyarak Sioux tribe. And I moved to Minnesota with my partner Inkpamani in 2021 when I first had my Winona. Her name is Wakcha Zizi Sapa White Cloud, and I am here today to talk about the design and the process of the beadwork. We're going to start with the design. At the very top, if you see this, the main purple flower with these two extending flowers, that is called the prairie crocus, or the Hokshi Chekpa Wakcha, also known as the baby's umbilical flower. It is the first flower we see in the spring, and most Dakotas see it as a good sign. And then the next part here that we'll talk about is the choke cherries. That's this big stem that curls up. Choke cherries, or pronounced chankpa, or bitterberry, is traditionally used as a ceremonial food, but we often use it to feed our relatives. We usually typically make what's called wojapi. Wojapi is kind of like a pudding. To make it, we typically put it in a pot and then you boil it until it becomes a thick syrup. The yellow part right here, this flower is called the yucca. It belongs to the yucca plant. And with the yucca plant, you typically find it on dry, not really where there's water, kind of prairie. It's more of a cactus plant, but you'll see when it flowers, if you touch the flower, it's very moist. And when you smell it, it smells like soap. And yucca plant, typically what we use it for is what we call it, soap. Soap weed, or they call it. And what you do is you take the root, you dig up the whole plant, you take the root, and you kind of take a comb and you scrape it. And once you scrape it, it'll start to foam, and kind of what we would use for soap, we'd use the yucca plant for. And then the next plant will be right underneath the yucca plant. It's Teamsilla, or what we call prairie turnip. Lakota people believe that turnips came from the stars in the sky. Teamsilla is typically used as more of a traditional plant, and it's known as an important food source for the Lakota and the Dakota people. I kind of added the turnip in the beadwork because I have a lot of good memories while picking turnips. What we used to do is we'd hop on horseback and we'd ride into the pasture, and typically it was in the hot summer days of June, so you'd kind of want a little snack. And what we'd do is we'd ride out, and as we're riding and we want to take a break, we'd go find the turnips. They have this really pretty purple flower that you'll see like in the mural, and you dig up the root, but when you dig up the root, you always want to put the flower back so that it could reseed and grow the next year and provide more food. But after you put the flower back, you take the turnip and you can eat it straight out of the ground. And most natives like that because it has kind of like an earthy taste, and it's one of the best tastes that I have experienced, and that's kind of what we like to do with turnips. The next plant we'll be talking about is this larger pink flower with the 4 interchanging leaves you'll see. It's also known as purple coneflower, or Ichank Bihu, hu referring to root. And the root can be smashed and applied to wounds and sores. The roots and seeds can be chewed to relieve colds, sore throats, toothaches, and it could also be used to quench your thirst. The smoke is used to treat headaches, while the top of the coneflower right here, the yellow part, once it dries out and becomes brown, you could actually use it as a hairbrush, and that's what they used to use it for. And then the next one we're going to be talking about is the main purple flower down here, this larger one with these, just the little green leaves. That's also known as wild bergamot, or what we call Hehaka tapejuta, or tapejut, or elk medicine. They refer to it as elk medicine because it's seen as a love charm. It's often picked to make tea and help treat abdominal pain, colds, and other various cold symptoms, kind of like the other plants here. Most of them are used to treat colds. And a poultice of the leaves can also be made to treat snake bites and prevent wounds from getting infected. The next one is sage, and that's the kind of sage green one that you'll see right here, also known as pejihota. Sage is typically picked at the end of summer, and what we use it as is we use it to smudge, and smudging is typically done to get rid of negative energy or spirits, and what we typically use it for is for ceremony and for sending prayers to the Creator. Sage medically helps prevent infection, and it's typically only the male sage that is picked. When it's women's sage, you'll see the flowers. The flowers will be on the sage, but it's only women that should be picking the women's sage. Male is universal, anyone can pick it. The last one we'll be talking about is this large green area right here, also known as bloodroot. And bloodroot is known as a blood medicine. Sometimes it helps to stop bleeding, mainly for women. It's a women's medicine. And it's only picked during a certain time of the year, and it's typically really only used in ceremony. And I want to stress that all the plants in this mural aren't picked just because. We pick them, or when we pick them, we want to give offerings, and typically what we give for offerings is water. You usually put down water in the ground, and sometimes food if you have some food on you. But what we usually use is water and tobacco, and we say a prayer. We thank these plants for providing us healing. We thank the plant for giving its life and for growing strong, and we ask that it comes back next year twice as strong so that we may reuse the source. So here is the original beadwork, and if you can see, like I said, here's prairie crocus. That's these two right here. This is the bigger flower in bloom, and here's the small flower as a bud. Then we have here the choke cherries, flame flowers. In the center, the yellow flower is yucca, and this is only the yucca bloom. Right here is the teamsula, or the prairie turnip, the flower, and this is what helps you identify it right here. It's this purple flower, and the leaves. The leaves typically have 5 little leaves, stars, purple coneflower along with sage, and then there's wild bergamot, and then the bloodroot. And so what the beadwork is on, it's on German tanned deer hide. It's maybe 11 inches by, I'd say, 5. The beadwork, most of the beadwork took around, I'd say, 16 hours to make. Each little piece taking close to 1 to 2 hours, especially these thinner lines here, if you can see. These thinner lines are what took longer to make because I had to put each individual bead down. And then, let's see what else is there. I do have a couple special beads in here, which are the light guppy sage right here, and then this green right here is called borealis lined olive green. And then another special bead that I have is this translucent white in the bloodroot flower. That's kind of a harder bead to get.
Another one of the important trees to Dakota people and culturally to this region is the birch bark tree. There's a lot of medicinal uses, there's practical uses. Like I was mentioning earlier, everything is broken down into kinship, practicality, and spiritual law. And the practical thing about birch bark trees is for hundreds and thousands of years, people have gathered the bark of this tree and they've used it for a wide variety of containers. They've also taken the bark of this and they used it for patterns, whether they're painting something or doing beadwork designs. The birch bark tree kind of had, its use in that way. And a lot of places where Dakota people lived, there was the birch bark tree that you could readily use for whether it was to make a small torch while you're hunting or you're going out at night. And you can use it, like I mentioned, the bark to make these containers that were used in a wide variety of utilitarian objects. And we also have within this image depictions of burial mounds. And the burial mounds it's a way that Dakota people for hundreds and thousands of years continued to make and use their landscape as a sacred site. And one of the things that we talk about back home in Sisseton is that, how could the land not be sacred? Because for thousands of years, the ancestors' bones have been placed back into the earth and to give back for everything that was given to them. And the Dakota people have been on this landscape for so long that the bones of their ancestors has become the earth. And all up and down the Mississippi River, up the St. Croix River, over to the Minnesota River, and even as far as the Missouri River, was lines and lines of burial mounds placed all throughout this region. And these burial mounds were made in very specific ways in different eras, where there was burying into the ground and placing the bones of their ancestors and using a wide variety of different clays and different colored earth pigments, which had symbolic representation. For thousands of years, there's been, thousands of people who have lived along the Mississippi River and a lot of the regional rivers, and they often had their campsites, located above the bluffs along these rivers. So either it's on the top of the bluffs or near the river. Dakota people often put their burial sites near this area. And the burial process often for Dakota people was that when somebody passed away, they put their body and wrapped their body in a buffalo robe and placed them on a wooden scaffold where they would stay for at least 4 days. And the family would leave their relative on that scaffold for a year. And when they would come back seasonally into this landscape again, they would collect those bones and they would place them under a little mound. And these mounds could be used for multiple generations. Sometimes it was just one family that was there. Sometimes it was multiple families. But these burial mounds had a big spiritual connection. And culturally, we see it from, Wisconsin, all the way over into South Dakota and North Dakota. For Dakota people, there's a lot of animals that have importance to them. But the one that is most often seen, whether it's at a powwow or a ceremony, is the connection to both the buffalo and the eagle. And this area is especially well known for its connection to eagles. Whether it's up on the bluffs and the returning of the golden eagles, or it's, in the springtime, when all of the bald eagles come and they hunt and they fish along the Mississippi River. But the eagle isn't just a bird, or something that Native people wear. There's a deep spiritual connection. And for Dakota people, that deep spiritual connection, it's their belief that it's a bloodline connection. And they say that Hekta Ehana Wanieto Ota, Dakota, there's a Dakota woman who survived a great flood over this landscape. And they say that her relatives and the other tribes, their blood all pooled and settled along the Minnesota region where Pipestone, Minnesota is today. But they say that she survived because an eagle came and saved her. And they said that she was climbing this mountain and she went up to the highest point And when she reached the top, she was exhausted because it was multiple days of bad weather, and she was really, really having a hard time. And when she was up there, she had nothing to eat. One of the stories that connect Dakota people to the eagle, and probably one of the most important, is that they say that Hekta Ehana, Wanietu Ota, Dakota Wiaki, she survived, or this Dakota woman survived a great flood. And some of the stories talk about that this woman and her family were trying to climb this large, large mountain to escape the waters. But most of the people and her family members, they were all swept away by the waters. But she kept climbing. She wanted to survive. And when she reached that top of the mountain, she was exhausted and she fell over and fainted. And when she woke up, she was heartsick. She realized she might be the only person to survive. And they say that all of the other people who died through the floods and the weather, their blood pooled into an area now known as Pipestone, Minnesota, in southwestern Minnesota. And so even the pipe has a connection to this story. And they say that when she was up on this mountaintop, she had no food, she had no firewood to keep herself warm, but this one eagle came by and was watching her. And this eagle had said, that it had watched her from when, before the flood, and wanted to keep her safe. So this eagle watched over her, and every day this eagle would go out and hunt and would get some fish and would bring it back to her. It would try to find some wood, and she could dry it out and prepare her meals, keep herself warm. It would grab some larger branches and different materials so she could build a lodge on top of this home. And after several weeks, they kind of developed a relationship and they talked to each other and they developed this deep bond. But the eagle kind of realized that there was something still missing from her. And so this eagle flew away, for 4 days, and it told, this Dakota woman, and it said, I'm going to go away for a time, but I'm going to come back. I need to speak to the Creator. So this eagle flew to the highest point, and it had a conversation with the Creator, and they talked. And the eagle said, it would be a shame if this was the end of the Dakota people. They've survived so much. Is there anything we can do to make sure, that they continue on? Is there anything I can do to help her, to make her happy again? So the Creator and the eagle had that conversation. At the end of the conversation, it was agreed upon that the only way to save the Dakota people is if the eagle sacrificed itself, and not like it giving its blood or anything like that, but if the eagle turned itself from an eagle into a man, that the Creator would give it that power to do that. And so the eagle had to think about it, because this was a big decision for it. It would never be able to fly and ride the winds and do all of the things it was able to before. So this eagle made that decision. And so in one morning, that young woman, she was missing him, and she was wondering where he was and was waiting for his return. And from the east he was coming, and she heard a noise, and she could hear his voice but couldn't see him yet. And so from behind a rock, the eagle came by and spoke her name, and she didn't recognize him at first. But when the eagle approached, the woman could see into his eyes and realized that eagle had transformed itself from an eagle into a man. And from that, when the eagle had transformed itself from an eagle to a man, it still had one plume left onto its body, onto the left side. So that eagle man took that plume and plucked it from itself and placed it onto her left side. And culturally today that still happens. Women wear their plumes onto the left side, and it represents, that connection to the eagle. And they say that from there, the waters eventually receded and started to go down. and they became a partnership. They became a husband and wife, and eventually they gave birth to twin boys. And those twin boys also kept exploring and going back into this new landscape, and they found other pockets of people who had also survived on top of mountaintops. And for this reason, they talk in Dakota culture that the eagle has that significance, that it's connected to the bloodline of Dakota people, because the eagle sacrificed itself so that the Dakota people could live. And Dakota people honor that eagle today by utilizing all parts of its body, being respectful to it, and honoring it in various different ways, whether it's ceremonies, songs, or dance. Culturally, that still holds place. Within this landscape, Dakota people have always talked about the importance of stars, whether it's the star within the center of a cottonwood tree, whether it was a medicine bundle connected to the stars. Dakota people understood that there was a connection between their bloodlines, their heritage, and the Milky Way and the stars in the sky. And one of the earliest stories coming, from origin of Dakota people talks about that in the sky there was a place in the north where the Dakota people escaped from, a hole in the sky, which was in the center of a grouping of stars. And the Dakota people escaped from those stars and landed on Earth. And when they came to Earth, they said they weren't quite physical yet. But when they entered into the shallow waters of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, where that place joins, it's called Bodote. And Bodote is that confluence of waters. And they say that from there, the Dakota people were transformed. They weren't quite yet, what we look like today, but that was the origin of when they first came onto Earth. And there's different stories that continue to bring Dakota people back into connections to stars, whether it's the Tipsida, the prairie turnip. There's a story that talks about that a woman from here on Earth, married one of the star people, and she went up into the sky, and she had married that spirit up there, and she became pregnant, and she was expecting a child, and she had been up there for a decent amount of time that she started to miss home. So she took things from the landscape and wanted to figure out how she could return. But the only instruction she was given is not to pick the tipsina that was up there in the sky world. But she was feeling that she wanted to return, so she plucked that tipsina from the sky. And when she looked at the hole that was left behind, she could see her village down below, so she was missing of it. So she took all of these tipsina, these prairie turnips, and she braided a rope, and she collected them all, and she took that rope and climbed herself down. And eventually she reached the end of the rope, and it wasn't quite long enough, so eventually she fell. But from the stories, they talk about that the prairie turnip has connections to the stars. Other connections to the stars is there's a story from a long time ago that there was a young woman who would take quill work, and she would make these designs out of porcupine quills, and she would stitch them. And she said that, for several nights and for a long time, she had these dreams of her 6 brothers. Even though that she was an only born child, she had dreams of, making these beautiful, beautiful embroidered shirts for her brothers. So she took these shirts, and she told her mother and her father that she had to go find whoever these young men were. And so she eventually came to this camp where these 6 brothers all lived together. And she gifted them these shirts, and they had a hunkaloapi, a making of relatives ceremony, and they became tighter than blood. They became relatives in that way. But amongst the other nations of the animal world, she was also sought after because of her quillwork designs. And they say that her quillwork designs came to her by dream, and she put them down. But these other nations wanted to make her part of their nation, And so she was sought after, and as the nations came to her, especially the Buffalo Nation, the brothers, they got together as the buffalo were surrounding them, and one of the brothers took his arrow and shot it into a tree, and that tree grew so that they could escape the buffalo, and the tree grew so high that it reached into the stars, and when they reached the stars, they became the 7 stars of the Orion constellation. And so for Dakota people, those 7 stars represent those 7 siblings and the love that can be made by making of relatives, the love of your family. But as time shifted as well, those stars also came to be known as the Ocheti, and the Ocheti Shakoi is the identification of the Dakota Lakota tribal nation. Ocheti Shakoi refers to the 7 council fires. The 7 fires, that started over here in Minnesota and spread, from one band to the other. And the Ocheti Shakoi started with the Bede Wakantua, then the Wahpekute, then the Wahpektua, then the Sisitua, the Ihanktua, and then finally the Titua, which made the 7 councils of the Ocheti Shakoi. And these stars are a reminder of that unison between the 7 councils as well. In Minnesota, one of the designs that is often admired amongst Dakota people is these floral designs. These floral designs originate from a time of around 1830 or mid-1830s, when beads became a little bit more available amongst trading posts and forts. And these designs had often connections to medicine recipes or different plants that were culturally significant to Dakota people. And from the 1830s up into the 1870s, these designs really flourished in that time frame. But over time, they started to be put away. These designs were not as favored, and a lot of it has to do with the uprising in Minnesota. As Dakota people were exiled and pushed out of their homelands, one of the most identifiable markers was these floral designs. And these floral designs, whether it was on a moccasin or a vest or some sort of clothing, could identify them to have belonged to a group from Minnesota. And Dakota people, during that time frame were hunted down, and this belief that they were part of a massacre or that they had done something to hurt. But this often wasn't the case. There was very few people, in comparison to the whole nation, that were involved with the uprising. So over time, these floral designs were put away. They were tucked away and hidden. But more recently, these designs kind of had a new revitalization, and they've kind of sprung up and have a new blossom. And these designs are important into our landscapes because it's a sense of identity, it's a sense of pride now for a lot of communities. To see these designs incorporated within public spaces that had often ostracized or put a lot of pressure negatively on Dakota people, it's saying to them that, it's a welcoming back into their original homelands. To see, these designs is something really special. This design is something that my partner beaded, and she has connections, to different communities of Dakota and Lakota. So she's bringing these things back into our landscape and helping it be seen again.